Now that we've gone through and we've created our work orders, obviously the next logical step in this is now we need to schedule them. We need to dispatch somebody out to be able to work with those individual items. And so that's where the scheduling options and dispatching options inside field service come into play. Now there's a lot of different options available to you from a scheduling perspective. One of the key aspects that we're going to look at in regards to this is using the schedule board to be able to manually schedule stuff. But there's also items such as the schedule assistant and different automation procedures that you can work in. The key thing to understand here is if we have the initial stuff set up, such as who our resources are and what characteristics and skill sets that those resources have and what territories are associated with these work orders and with these accounts, it's going to make that process much easier. So in this module, what I want to really talk about is just what are some of the different options that are available from a scheduling perspective inside field service. How does the schedule board work? We're going to take you in and show you exactly what the schedule board looks like. We're going to talk a little bit about the layout of the schedule board, some of the customization options that are available from the schedule board, how you can use some of the filtering options, what the individual pieces mean, what options and tools are available for you to be able to move and attach different bookings and different items to different work orders as you're going through and handle how things are being scheduled. And then also look at the scheduling assistant, how the scheduling assistant can be used to go out and define what individual information is working with based upon who the items are and what specific skill sets and timeframes might be needed. And then we'll look at like resource bookings, what that actual record looks like that's being created once you go ahead and schedule somebody to perform some type of service inside the application. The area that's probably going to get used the most from a scheduling standpoint inside the application is really the schedule board. And the schedule board is pretty unique in the fact that it's a drag and drop interface that allows you to go out and schedule or reschedule work orders based upon specific criteria. And what's neat about the schedule board is they recently overhauled it from a field service perspective and really changed how you work with it from an interface perspective. You now have the ability to see images that are associated with specific resources. So those pull right from their contact record if it's a contact-based resource, or from their user account if it's a user-based resource. You can actually see how busy they are based upon their schedule preferences. So you can see percentage of their schedule that's filled within individual time frames. You have the ability to see color codes based upon who the individual person is, which makes it easier for you to go in and start to schedule this stuff. Now, as you're going through and scheduling it, if you're looking for specific characteristics or you're looking for specific types of resources or skill sets, you have the ability within the schedule board to actually filter down the information based upon what you're working with. So now you can go in and you can actually filter things down to only get a subset of resources that might be most qualified for whatever it is that you're trying to accomplish. Now, in addition to that, the interface that you're seeing from a schedule board perspective is highly customizable. So the different dispatchers or people who are going to be scheduling these options can actually create different schedule boards based upon their needs. So depending upon how they might be wanting to schedule and what their preferences are, they can highly customize and tailor the schedule board to fit their specific needs. Now, the first thing I want to do is just kind of take you into the schedule board and really just give you a tour of how it's laid out and what some of the individualized options are as you're working through. There's a couple of different ways we can get into the schedule board. Now, first and foremost, the schedule board is a component of field service. So if I have field service installed, I do have the capabilities to navigate to the schedule board as part of field service. The other option that you have is this unified scheduling or resource scheduling option. Now, this is what allows you to schedule other entities outside of just work orders inside the application. Now, that does require, at the very least, field service or project service automation to be one of the services that you do have as part of your system. You don't necessarily have to just strictly schedule that stuff, but in order to enable that functionality, you do need to have it. And so that's what's going to give you this resource scheduling option. Ultimately, whether you choose it through field service or through the resource scheduling option, the schedule board is going to take you to the exact same spot, which is kind of a dynamic populated calendar that coordinates based upon initial items and resources that are available inside your organization. So as this kind of loads, I'll be able to see individualized resources as part of my organization, and I'll be able to see what specifically is happening inside my organization. So over here, I can see that I have specific people that I'm working with as part of my organization. So I can see, who the person is, and I can actually, as I hover over those individual people, I now can see specific things about them. So I can see what skills they possess, I can see what roles are assigned to them inside the organization, and I can start to have a better look and feel for who they are as a person as a whole. Now, what's also nice about this is if I have Skype for Business integration turned on, I now also have the capabilities to come over and hover directly over any one of these individual options, and I can actually send an instant message to this person directly from within here. I could send an email, or I could even do click to dial and create a phone call activity that would allow me to interact with this specific person as part of the application. Now, the other thing that they've added as part of this service schedule calendar is down here. So down here I can see kind of the legend. Then this really tells me the individualized booking statuses that I have for the people who are taking advantage of these individual items. So I can see as I work through here, I can see who's traveling in relation to going to a work order. I can see who's on break. I can see who's actually completed a work order. I can see who's in progress and how much time has been associated with that. So just at a glance, I have the abilities to go in and see specifically what the status is for those individual bookings as we're working through. Now, by default, when you come into the scheduling calendar, it's typically going to show you just today's area. So if you want to work with individualized days or previous days, you can actually back information up, and this would allow you to see subsets of information from this day or a different day based upon the items that you want to work through. So there's lots of different options for how this information can be scheduled within the application. Now, the other thing that's nice is as you hover over some of these individual options and as you work through them, it'll give you some specifics. It'll give you start time, it'll give you duration, estimated arrival time, what work order it's associated with. And as you click on these individual options, you actually can expand the details section. And this detail section is going to tell you specifics about that option. It's going to tell you the resource that's attached to it. It's going to give you your starting time, your end times. It's going to give you the type of work order. It'll show you address information. Basically anything that you might need to know in regards to this. And if there was any alerts or if there was anything that had been triggered that we really needed to be aware of, we would also be able to see the alerts within this context as well to be able to determine if I have specific issues or items that I need to be aware of. Now, the other thing that you'll see in here is this filter option. When I expand it, I can see different options for how I want to filter this schedule board. So if I'm a dispatcher or I'm somebody who needs to kind of find specific resources that fit a specific need, I can come in here now and I can filter this information based upon different characteristics. Now I can see here that this one is already kind of pre-filtered. It's looking at, from a resource type standpoint, it's looking at any account resources, contact resources, and user and equipment resources. But if I had created or I wanted to look at specific resources based upon organizational unit or teams that they were a member of, I would now be able to select those individual options, and this would go through and filter the schedule board appropriately. This would also allow me to look at specific subsets of characteristics, and now I could choose anybody who has building 12 access, and now I could actually look at their proficiency option and say anybody, we'll say any rating for that particular option. And as I go through and I hit search, now it's going to go through and it's going to search and it's going to refilter the schedule board based upon anybody who has that specific characteristic associated with them. So now you have the ability to really start to look at this information holistically in regards to how you want to work through. So the nice thing about this is it's a very highly tailorable, kind of customizable interface. If I want to remove that characteristic, I can simply click on the X to remove that characteristic. I can research my option. It'll refilter the information and reload the scheduling bar based upon that item. Now, the other thing that's nice with this is, as you can see, a lot of this information does tend to take up a little bit of real estate. So I do have the capabilities to expand and collapse some of these individual items as needed, just to clear up and free up more space as I'm working through this and make it much easier for the dispatcher to navigate through the application. Now, the other option is there's really two different ways that I can filter this information. I can use the filter option, which has kind of the predefined filtering capabilities, or I can go into my map view. And when I go into my map view, this is actually going to take a map of all of my individual items that I'm working with, and it's going to show me where those specific situations are. So as I'm looking at these individual situations, I can now see specific unscheduled work orders within the application. So anytime I hover over something or I click on something, I can basically see that I have an item or a work order that is open but hasn't necessarily been scheduled. As I zoom in or out of these individual scenarios, I can now start to see different color-coded options based upon who they are. And one of the things that you'll see as I hover over this is by simply switching to the map view, now I've come over into this scenario here, and I can also see that each one of these resources now have a color pin associated with that. So now when I have resources that are out in the field that are actually going through and dispatching and working through these items, I can actually see pins that would associate where, Edgar or where Jorge is in the grand scheme of things as we're scheduling. So these pin options actually show up in color code based upon the fact that I've chosen the map view as I've worked through. Now, this gives me a lot of different options to be able to define how I want to schedule things. So for example, if I'm working through an individual item, and I want to see a specific work order that I want to schedule within the system itself, I can actually drag this work order directly over into the schedule board, drop it into a specific spot for a person, and that would schedule that automatically for me inside the application. Now, we'll show you that here in another example here in just a couple of seconds. The other things that you'll see inside here is how you want to view it. So here it's looking at it more from an hours mode perspective, but you also could look at the schedule board, in a day mode standpoint. So you could organize it by days and start to look at kind of scheduling options based upon individualized days that people are working with. I could go back into weeks, months. It really gives you different options based upon how you want to define it. There's also different views that allow you to control how the information is laid out inside the actual schedule board itself. So from a view perspective, I can click on different view options and I can look at things laid out a little bit differently based upon their hourly time frames. So it'll then organize things a little bit different. I can look at their schedule more in an up and down fashion as opposed to in that vertical standpoint as I'm going through. So it gives you multiple options to be able to define how you want to work through this. Now, the other thing that's kind of neat about this as you're moving forward is you also have the ability to interact with some of these individual options. So for example, if I come over into this actions, I can see that there's options here to move specific bookings and items to other days. So if I want to get driving directions, I can go ahead and I can click on driving directions, and this would allow me to create a driving direction based upon who the resource is and where they're located at this very moment based upon where they want to go. And now I could take these driving directions and I could email these driving directions or print these driving directions out so a person would have that. So I could look at specific locations based upon where somebody is, look at their starting and ending address, and now define driving directions. Or if for some reason this particular item is not going to be able to be accomplished during this specific period, I would now have the capabilities within these actions as well to move this booking to the next day. Now, depending upon what you do or do not have selected, you do actually have the option to move kind of entire bookings to the next day if you want to. So if there's specific items that you need to move forward, you can move individualized bookings forward as needed to be able to facilitate that. Or if you wanted to create additional alerts or items, you could work through situations from there. Now again, this is highly configurable, so one of the things that you can also do in here is you can go into the scheduler settings, and this is where you can define kind of what that working time frame period is that's going to be displayed within the schedule board. You can look at time resolutions, you can define sizes. One of the key things that you can actually do in here is if you have a more experienced dispatcher who's really already comfortable with these color coding options, you could choose to hide the legend here. And then from that perspective, by hiding the legend, you would just free up a little bit more space within the schedule board to be able to constitute what it is that you're doing. From a booking perspective, this is where you can actually go out and you can book specific resources for the item that you want to work with. So there's a lot of different options to create bookings. This is where you could pick a specific work order that you wanted to book. You could pick the resource that you wanted to book it for, pick the status, specify when it is and the start and time frame, how long you wanted to work with it, and this is where you could book that information out. So this allows you to actually create kind of bookings on the fly. Now the other piece that you have to this schedule board is the actual views. So right now you'll see that this is the initial view. We'll talk a little bit about this in the next couple of minutes, but you'll notice there's an option here. Dispatchers who are working with the schedule board do have the capabilities to create additional views as needed to go ahead and constitute what they might be working with most often. And then the other option that you have down here is this booking requirements. These are going to show you any of your unscheduled or items that need to be booked inside the application. So here I can look at work orders that are unscheduled in the application, as well as other items that may need to be scheduled out as part of this application. The schedule board allows you, as you're working through this information, these are just views. So this is where we could customize this just as you would kind of customize any other CRM view. But this also gives me the capabilities to do sorting options on these individual items. I can resize these columns as needed to determine what the individual item is that I'm working with. These are all different items that I can use to define how I want to lay things out into the schedule board so those can be used as I'm working forward. As your dispatchers are scheduling situations, one of the easiest ways to schedule items within the schedule board is manual scheduling. The dispatcher is going to determine what the work order is that needs to be scheduled, and then they're going to drag it to specific spots within the application to work through it. Now there's a couple of different ways that you can actually schedule stuff as part of the scheduling. The first way is to actually just take that unscheduled work order from kind of the list view at the bottom and just drag it up into the schedule board and associate it with the appropriate resource at the appropriate time. The other option that you kind of saw us do a little bit when we were first initially looking at it through the map view is if you have one of those pins on the map view, you can take a schedule option and you can just drag it over from the map view into the item. You also have the capabilities to kind of block out a spot on the schedule and then schedule the information directly from that standpoint. Now, in addition to just scheduling items, as you have work orders or items that are working through there, you can reassign or drag and drop information for work orders to new people or reschedule previously scheduled work orders. You can update statuses of work orders. You can change durations on work orders as you're working through these. You can move work orders that haven't been completed, like we saw kind of a little bit earlier, to a future date, or you can even do different situations like printing off and emailing driving directions. So let's look at just a little bit around the manual scheduling options that are available inside this. So down on where I have my booking requirements, these are my unscheduled work orders. So if I wanted to take a work order and schedule it, for example, for Edgar, this is where I could now take this item from down here, drag it up into my individual item, and as I start moving it forward on here, I can see specific slots where I want to schedule this individual item. As I let it go, it's going to kind of drag that option into here. It'll then show me the duration before it finally commits that option onto the actual work order calendar itself. If I needed to, I could adjust this just by strictly dragging the individual information on the side to adjust the time frames appropriately as needed as I'm going through. In addition to this, I also have the ability to change the status of this. So this is where I can go into this option here and I can look at what's happening from this scenario. So if I know that somebody is traveling, this is where I could go out and I could specify the status as traveling, and I could then adjust that information accordingly, and it would then update the item on the schedule board very quickly based upon those individual situations. So what's nice about this interface is it does make it easier for you to go ahead and specify how you want to adjust this information accordingly just by simply clicking the individual options that you want to work with and then scheduling the information from there. Now the other way that you could do this, is we saw this a little bit earlier, is you could use your map view. By simply expanding out some of my information on my map view, I would now have the capabilities to start to see all my unscheduled items. And by simply dragging an item over into here, I would now be able to go out and see specifically where I wanted to work with on those items in the map view. So this would give me the capabilities to zoom into a specific kind of quadrant or sector of items that I want to go through. It'll then start to show me some of the individualized items that I want to work with. And now I could basically come into here and I could drag these individual options over into my calendar and then position it where I wanted to, and that would create the appointment. The other option that I could do is I can just click kind of a starting point, use my shift key, drag kind of a duration that I want to work with, let go, and it's going to open up my options here, and this is where it'll show me all of my unscheduled work orders. And so in here now I could just select a specific work order, and by selecting that work order, it'll automatically create the item with the duration and associate it inside the application. So it makes it very easy for you from a dispatching standpoint to be able to go out and kind of define how you want to dispatch this information and then move things around accordingly based upon what you're doing. What's ultimately happening as you're going in and creating these is what's happening is you're creating what's called a resource booking. So if I were to go up into my kind of resource options and I were to go into, for example, field service, I can go into resource bookings. And this is actually what gets created kind of behind the scenes. And if I just switch this to active resource bookings, we'll give this just a sec here. These active bookable resource bookings show me what's kind of taking place. So it shows me the resource, it shows me the start time, the end time, the duration, it shows me the booking status, it shows me how it's been defined within the application. These are the records that subsequently are created based upon the item when you add it to the schedule board. And the nice thing about going in and modifying some of those durations inside the schedule board is this is what's ultimately getting modified. So you don't necessarily have to go into here and look at this. You would more often than not, from a technician perspective, go into your active bookable resource bookings and see what specific items have been booked for you directly. But from a dispatcher, when I'm working on the schedule board itself, as I go in and I update some of those individual options, those are what ultimately are reflecting on those resource bookings. And those typically get updated fairly quickly. So you'll notice very shortly after you drag something to the schedule board, it'll update that with the appropriate information so you have it, and those resource bookings or those bookable resource bookings will be modified accordingly as you're working through. At some point, the dispatcher who's going to be scheduling all of this information is going to really want to tailor the information to fit the way that they work. And so it might be a situation where, you've got 5 or 6 different territories that you're working with, or you've got, 5 or 6 different areas that you're working through. And so it might be beneficial to have different schedule boards that would reflect the different types of situations that you need to schedule for. And so what's neat with the schedule board is it does give you a configuration option where you can really add as many different tabs to the schedule board as needed. Now, what's nice about these tabs is each one of these tabs will have their own version of the board. So resources can be filtered however you want to. You can define, how you want to name that information. You can also define what specific information you want to pull into that in regards to how many records you want to pull in, what colors you want to use in regards to how things are categorized from a coloring standpoint. You also have the capability when you want to start getting into, even unified scheduling. So if you're going to use the schedule board for scheduling things like cases or accounts or opportunities or other entities that you've enabled for the schedule board, you also have the capabilities now to configure how those entities are going to show up within those individual options. So I want to take just a second and pop you into the schedule board, and we'll just do some baseline configuration of that and show you how to add an additional tab. So as you can see here, I have my initial view, and we showed you earlier how if you wanted to, you could modify that initial view. Let's just go ahead and double click on that initial public view, and this will open up the view properties for the schedule board that we can maintain. So if I wanted to have, different GPS locations, if I wanted to enable or disable GPS syncing, I could work with that. If I wanted to define what specific views we wanted to use for individual items, I can look at views that are associated with the resource requirements that we want to work work with. I also have the capabilities to come down into these areas here, and if I want to modify, individual situations such as how schedules are presented in here, this is where if I'm using unified scheduling and I have different items, I can specify what specific views we're going to use, and then I can also define what specific options we want to use for the requirements panel down on the bottom. So you really can tailor this to fit your specific needs. Now, if you want to create your own view, right next to the initial public view, there's just an add tab option. And so you're really just adding kind of a new tab to this view to work for your specific situations. So you would come in, you would click on the option to add your tab, and then you would have pretty much the exact same situation that you would see in here. So I could define this as Derek's view. I can define whether or not this is going to be a public or a private view. So is this going to be a view that I'm going to use within my specific item? So we'll say Derek's view. We'll make this a public view so it's readily available to everybody else. Now I can go into my general settings, and this is where if I wanted to modify how the maps were going to work, this is where I could now define what specific views I wanted to use in regards to the item. By default, everything will use default views, but if you've gone in and you've created custom views inside the application to fit your specific needs, those views can all be referenced within this particular item. As you've gone through and modified each individual component, now you can just go ahead and hit add, and now it's going to add that tab. So now I can very easily switch between whichever two views I want to use within the application. Now it will reload the information, so it'll take a few seconds to reload, but it gives you kind of that new methodology or new way of being able to view and outline how that information is going to work. So it's a very nice customization option based upon your specific needs. The other option that you have when it comes to scheduling these individual items is to use the Schedule Assistant, where the schedule board is more of a manual process where you're going to click and drag and you're going to move things around onto the schedule board just based upon where you feel like they fit best, and then obviously you can readjust things accordingly based upon those situations. The Schedule Assistant is a much more definitive assisted type of scenario where you're going to be able to look at specific parameters or items and apply different constraints to items to make sure that it will filter and go out and find the most available resource based upon those constraints. And when we talk about constraints, we talk about different types of situations. So obviously each one of these work orders or each one of these resource bookings that you're looking at is going to have a specific duration. So if we're looking for a specific person who has that type of duration available during a specified time period, you can specify that. You also have the capabilities to look at a radius. So for example, if you have a customer who is located downtown and you're looking for technicians or people who would be available within a 20 or 30 mile radius of that particular customer, you now have the capabilities to look at people who are within the proximity of that specific service location so you can send people off to dispatch them. But you also have the capabilities to get into things like start and end days. So we're not necessarily sure when we want this to begin, but I know that it needs to start maybe on the 1st of the month or and potentially sometime between the 5th of the month. So I have a 5-day window in which I could go out and schedule someone to work with that. That's really where the scheduling assistant is going to be at an advantage to allow people to kind of work through it. So let's just go ahead and take a look at how the scheduling assistant works and what are some of your different options for utilizing the scheduling assistant inside the application. So there's a couple of different ways that the assistant can be accessed inside the application. First one is kind of directly from the work order or the item that you want to schedule. So if I go back into my field service and I go into work orders, I can look for items that have currently been either scheduled or not scheduled within the system. Let's just create kind of a new work order here from scratch, and we'll walk through the scheduling assistant option. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a new work order. We'll associate this with just any service account at this point, doesn't necessarily matter. We'll associate it with the MRI inspection incident type. We'll leave territory open at this point. We'll leave currency kind of as it is. We'll make it non-taxable. Now we'll go ahead and just save it. And once this is saved, what I'll see is on the actual command bar is I'll actually see an option here for the schedule assistant. And so what the schedule assistant is going to do now is it's going to go out and it's going to allow me to find people who will be most qualified or would be able to be scheduled within a specific time frame. So as you can see, I can evaluate some of this information in real-time mode if necessary. So I do have the capabilities to define how I want to look for those individual people. I also have the capabilities to look at this in more of a list view, or also to look at it in more of a map view. So depending upon what my personal preference is in regards to how this information should be displayed, I would now have the capabilities to look at that information accordingly based upon those options. Now I can work through my specific area. So here's my radius. So here's where I can define what I am looking at from a proximity standpoint. So obviously, depending upon your geographic region, you do have the capabilities to organize this by miles or kilometers based upon what it is that you're working with. But here's kind of the key thing that I wanted to show you is how it's going to be searching this information. So again, depending upon when these resources might be available, we would now have the capabilities to specify what's the starting time and the ending time. Well, I know it needs to take place at some point in time, this week. So I know it needs to take place, at least sometime before, around 9 a.m. today, and then I want to go all the way out into maybe the end of next week, and I could specify a specific time at that end of next week. So here's my time range. Now, if you think about this in practicality purposes, if you were a dispatcher who was going out and doing this, you might limit this down to initial, 1 or 2 days, maybe one just initial day within that item that you're going through. Now I can go through and I can continue to build my individual items. So this is looking at the work order, and it's been basically determined that on the work order we specified, because it's an MRI inspection, that they have to have building 12 access. So this is going to look for any resource type who has that specific type of access within the application itself. And then you also have the capabilities to filter it down by individualized resource type. So if I only want to search for users, I would have the capabilities to do that. If I want to search for contacts or maybe third-party vendors, I would have the capabilities to specify a contact or an account to really further granularize down what the information is that I want to look at. And then I also have the capabilities to, if I'm not finding the specific results that I want to look at, I also have the capabilities to maybe not take the location into account. Maybe if travel time is something that has been billed as part of that particular work order, I would have the capabilities to ignore travel time. So you do have the ability to filter things down quite a bit to find whatever specific resource is going to work best for you based upon those options. And then once you're ready to go, you can go ahead and hit search resources. It'll go out then, look on the schedule board, and determine if there's any resources that would come back and meet that criteria. Now, if you don't have any resources that meet that criteria, this is where you could now start removing specific options and then going out and finding one that might specifically meet that information based upon what you're working with. So the scheduling assistant does give you a few different options from that perspective. You also would have the capabilities, if you go back into the field service schedule board, you also have the capabilities to use the scheduling assistant directly from the schedule board as well. So on the schedule board, when you're looking at your specific options, when you go into your unscheduled work orders and you look at your booking requirements for those unscheduled work orders, you would now have the capabilities to right click on that, and now you have the capabilities to find availability. So based upon what resources you're working with, or all resources within the system, you would have the capabilities to do find availability, and that would then open up the scheduling assistant and you would be able to maintain those same options. So you have two real options here when it comes to scheduling. You can use the schedule board from kind of a manual perspective to drag the information in, or you can use the scheduling assistant to have a little bit more of an automation process around it. Now, the other option that you would have would be resource optimization. Now, that's an add-on solution that would allow you to define specific resource automation rules that you want to use. So when things are created, it's going to look at specific criteria. It's going to go out and find service preferences for customers, and then it would automatically schedule some of that information for you as well. Now, we're not going to get into that in the concept of this course, mainly just because it is an add-on solution, but it is something to consider. Generally speaking, you typically want to understand what that process looks like first and have your scheduling board and your scheduling assistant rules set up first. Once you understand how that's going to work, then you can get into things like resource optimization and using some of that information as your to expand what it is that you're trying to do. having a plan for how you're going to schedule your work orders is very important. And so the nice thing about the application, as you could see in this previous module, is you do have a lot of options. The schedule board is really the best first and foremost option that you're going to have when you start talking about how you want your dispatchers to interact and view all the different resources from an application standpoint. But if you need to, you do have the ability to look at things like your scheduling assistant to add that little extra dimension. And so from a module standpoint, just remember that, you know, the schedule board, like I said, is really one of the easiest ways to locate and assign resources for your work orders. It's not only going to give you the capabilities to see what resources are available, but you'll also have the capabilities to interact with those resources. One of the nice things about it that we saw from an application standpoint is if you have Skype integration enabled, you actually can hover over your individual resources and you can do things like send emails, place phone calls, work with instant messages, and you have the capabilities to see from a scheduling standpoint how busy they actually are within the application. Are they 50% busy? Are they 60% busy? That gives you a mechanism to be able to define how you want to work those schedules options in there. It also gives you the capabilities to not only look at how that information is working, but when you're scheduling that, you have the ability to filter things down. So if you want to limit it by territory, you can go in and limit it by territory, but you also have the ability to make on-fly adjustments to those appointments. As we saw, you can drag and drop the items not only to the scheduling calendar, but once you schedule or send them to the board, you have the ability to hover over those items and change the duration and modify how long those items are going to work, and also modify the statuses directly from there. So if you want to modify somebody into traveling because now they're traveling, you can work with that. Now when we get into other modules like the mobile application, we'll talk a little bit more about how the actual field technician is going to work with some of that from while they're in the field. But from a scheduling board standpoint, you do have almost real-time notification in regards to what's happening based upon what you've set your refresh intervals to work with. Now if you need to, you can also use the scheduling assistant. If you're looking for a little bit more guidance and a little bit more automation around that, the scheduling assistant provides a great mechanism to be able to add some additional filtering and work with items based upon date ranges. And if you're still looking for more of an automated process, that's where you could look on for add-ons like the resource optimization tool that would now allow you to go ahead and set up some predefined and configured options for how you want to schedule that information inside your field service deployment.